to welcome Karlene Kantner. She is
Hey.
a ceramics artist. She'll talk to us a little bit about her teaching background and how it's informed her work. She'll share some of her early work and bring us up to date with where she's at now as a current air at Flower City Art Center in ceramics. She would like to keep it a little bit more informal, so if questions come up for you during her talk, feel free to say, hey, I have a question, and we'll address it then. And then we'll also have a little time at the end to talk further and ask more questions. Okay, great.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I just want to thank you all for coming. I was just telling Liz and Juliana what a cool opportunity and honor it is to be able to talk about my work right now with you all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and show you kind of a slideshow of a bunch of images. And that will kind of help us move along through my thought process. I can be a little long-winded because I'm kind of an introspective person. So I wanted to share with you not only images of my work, but also just certain things that I think about while I'm in the studio. And maybe that can help bridge the gap between the forms, the work that I make, and then maybe what certain things could mean, or, kind of some more conceptual ideas. So, but yes, please ask a question at any time. You're more than welcome. So my first slide is just a detail shot of a lineup of small bud vases that I made in Montana, actually, before I moved to Rochester. And some of these photographs are 35 millimeters shots that my boyfriend Chris actually took. So I think it really adds to the nice beauty there. So my first slide here is one of my most favorite projects that I did with a group of kids in a class that I titled Glitter Mania. It was quick to fill up, I tell you what. And basically what I prompted them to do was to take this huge load of fabric that I dumped in front of them, and then a variety of glittery ribbons and twine. And I asked them to do whatever they wanted to do with it, and that we would kind of present their final piece in the park in downtown. And they decided to hand tie this huge quilt, hang it up in the park, and then just invite kids that they didn't know, other kids at the park, to come and sit inside their little tent and just chat. And this particular experience was, I think, really powerful for all of us to experience that process of hand tying all of these fabric pieces, and also the process of community connection. What it means to spark up conversation with other kids your age, and just the kind of the organic flow of that process. I was really blown away. Another kind of a project that we did that is informed by this sort of layering, this process and intention, was this card project that we did where the kids walked around, kind of tiptoed on all of these scraps that I had laid out throughout the classroom. And I had laid them out on top of the table and under chairs, and kind of in this little, like, what do you call it? Little puzzle around the room. And meanwhile, they were stepping in these globs of paint and spreading them throughout the room. And then by the end, when all the paint was used up and the room was thoroughly splotchy, we gathered our favorite scraps and then made collage cards for people that they appreciated in their lives. And it was kind of a really nice tactile way for them to experience intention and this process and caring. This last piece I'll share it was also a paper collage project. And this individual, this little kid who was in kindergarten, and he came to class with his older brother every day. He was quite shy, but one day brother couldn't come. But instead of having an emotional like fit or breakdown, he just like exploded with his materials and experienced quite a true freedom and like tender afternoon, I think, for him. He didn't really talk to anybody, but he ended up, I just love like this process of expansion and self-awareness there. So I've taught for about a little over 10 years at a art center in Missoula, Montana. And I was really lucky because I was able to come up with really out of the box projects for these kids to do. My curriculum was super free, and I was really lucky. We did after school and summer camps. So I think that through all of that time, I was able to experiment with my own kind of like reckoning of with what it means to work as a community creatively, and then what it means for a child to come of age or to grow up or to experience years of creative work, and how that influences both their day-to-day, but then also like how that influences how they make friendships and function socially. So this sort of process, this sort of step-by-step, all-encompassing framework really influenced my work. And I show this basket that I made in undergrad because I think it really represents that idea of process, time, that kind of like self-labor. And I don't know, each of these, I guess I'll just tell you about the piece itself. Each of these beads, as you can see, are hand tied together with wire. And you can see these kind of layered texture here. I'll jump into a process photograph series with you in a moment, but just imagine that each of these layers are a slab, like a really thin slab that I scored and slipped together one by one. So a lot of time, kind of meditative, repetitive process that in turn makes one finished bead, and that feels really good. But then you make another one, and you make another one, and you continue to build on this kind of formative idea, and then at last tie them all together. And I made a couple handles and ended up with a vessel.
Karlene, how large is that piece overall, and how large are each of those beads?
Oh, good question. The beads are about probably like 1.5 inches wide in their diameter, and then they're kind of like flying saucers. Like they kind of have that sort of shape. I don't know if like maybe this one could represent that. It's maybe about 1 inch or so tall. So the whole thing is almost probably from end to end is about 1.5 feet. It's been a little while since I've seen this piece. I was actually really fortunate. The Montana Museum of Art and Culture purchased this piece. So it's been a while since I've seen it, but it's about 1.5 feet by 1 foot.
And is it very heavy, like the density of the pieces? Yeah.
Yeah, it's heavy. I mean, you can hold it with two. I feel like any one of us could hold it, carry it around. And it's really nice because of this kind of chain link design, the bottom will dip and it acts like a real, functional basket. Crunchy though.
One more question.
Sure.
I'm sorry to overtalk. The
okay.
Material that you use to link them together, is that a kind of a wire, or is
Yes.
it something that's more, yeah?
Mm-hmm. It's a wire. It's a kind of a smaller gauge, I guess. Maybe there's a better term for it. Smaller gauge wire that really only took some needle nose pliers in my hands. It wasn't too like hard to work with. So here's my process. I start by wedging my clay body, all kinds of clay bodies. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I always incorporate a lot of sand. And basically it's because I just saw someone use paddle sand on the outside of their work one time, and I just thought it was so gorgeous. So I just jumped right in and I wedge it up, smash it into sand, and then I roll it out into a really thin slab, kind of like a sugar cookie dough. So if anybody grew up making sugar cookies, you can kind of picture the process of sprinkling out the flour, except in this case it's sand, rolling out the dough with your rolling pin. But instead of cutting out cookies, I tear them into strips like this, and use those strips to make whatever it is that I'm going forth to do. So I actually just snapped these pics this morning. They're really rushed, but gives you kind of a sense of how I always start at the base. The foundation is really important because in the end, the pieces become pretty delicate in nature. And so if the base is strong, I know that it'll be able to last and it'll be able to hold up whatever kind of form I have in mind. This is a work in progress that's on my porch right now. That's where I've been working lately. It's a bird bath, will be. So we have a kind of the base here, and then right where these arches begin is going to be kind of the middle connecting point, and then it will come out. But instead of kind of talking about what will be, we'll talk about what was.
Can I just ask you quick?
Yeah, sure.
How do you make it so stable? Do you work, like, because it looks very airy, and there seems to be in the middle a lot of weight on it. So do you let it like dry first and then you do the top on it, or?
I'm so glad you asked, Josie, because I forgot to really mention that. So yeah, timing is everything. If you can see, like each of these, with this piece in particular, I have these small like spheres, little balls that are the feet. And I let those kind of set up, so that they're kind of strong, not dry by any means, but nice and firm, almost leather hard. And then I tend to work with a lot of circles and a lot of arches. And that is because that is just architecturally a strong form. And so in the end, my work, ends up referencing a lot of kind of ceremonial and reverent places that I ended up like growing up visiting. I had a really spiritual like household, and my parents were quite devout, and we kind of had like me and my sisters like all dreamed of being nuns when we grew up. So we kind of had little bit of a monastic influence. So I'm not sure if that comes out at all, but so anyway, the arches contribute to the strength, Josie. And you're right about all of this negative space. Sometimes I really go for that. Other times you'll see I have more solid forms. So this is a kiln that I used to fire in Montana. And I'm just going to show some quick images of this kiln because it was super formative in my ideas of work and process and time. So it's a large style anagama. And I was firing this kiln when I was working on my BFA year, teaching part-time, interning at the Clay Studio of Missoula. So I was really busy. So I did my shifts were always like in the middle of the night because that's when I could find some solace, and actually it's when I was available. So I didn't really sleep that much, but this is, I guess I'll go back. So you can see we start the fire on the outside just to slowly ease into the heat. And this is the next slide is a shot from this window right here. So you can see the sparks coming in and the work slowly heating up. And for those of you who haven't been introduced to wood firing before, the basic concept is that there is a chimney in the back of the kiln that pulls the fire through, and the flame kind of swims quite literally in between every pot and flashes on the clay bodies and the glazes. And then the ash kind of melts onto the shoulders of the pots. So this is the inside of the same kiln there. That's me, long time ago. So cute. Here's the back. There's other holes where we would stoke these longer pieces in. And I think wood firing gave me such a gift of community and like self-determination. It was everything. But I decided to try, sorry. So this is one last thing. This is a smaller bud vase. This is only like maybe about 7 inches tall, made in that same sort of slab form. And hikadashi is the process where you'll stick a iron rod through one of the windows in the kiln and pop one of the pots out while it's still firing, and it comes out red hot, and it's really dramatic and fun. But you can kind of tell what the surfaces are looking like in there. And now this is my first one, so I guess I was proud of it and I put it in here. Here are some buckets that I had made. These are each about 25 inches tall. And at this time, because the firings were so laborious, they took like 2 weeks. Somebody was there 24/7. I was really thinking a lot about work and like what it meant for one's identity to be working, and how our work influences how we view ourselves and how that contributes to humility, and also pride at the same time. Here's a detail shot. I have a lot of details just because of all of the. Here's another pail. It's a smaller.
So Karlene, it looks like some of your pieces do have some glaze and other pieces are not glazed. And as a non-ceramic artist, I don't know if like the glazing if there's always glaze on it, because that's a necessity and it's just that you can't really tell that it's glazed because there's no color. Could you talk a little bit about some of that? I mean, are you going for embellishing with texture, a little bit of shine here and there? Does that have like a big role in your vision of the finished piece?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I will admit that I don't usually glaze at all. So none of this work has been glazed. It's simply the clay body. So this is, for instance, this is a porcelain piece, and all of the different variation of color is from like flame and ash hitting the piece in particular ways. So the clay body itself, is really important to me, because in the end, these are vessels, right? So, as a vessel, I think it speaks a lot to like the human body, us being a vessel. And so I find that really important. And to speak to the texture that you asked about, glaze would really muddle up a lot of this texture. So I keep it as raw as possible. This is just a quick transition shot. This is me and I finally got my own studio. And so I was able to work on a big project for myself. I had a show that I titled Light and Sound Series, where I made 2 kind of bodies of work. One were music boxes and the other candelabras. And so I was able to talk about like the way that light and form kind of work together. I was thinking a lot about stillness and process. And this was certainly a very ritualistic sort of project. So you can see I have 2 candelabras here. These are both wood fired. Sorry, there we go. I'm sorry. Here's a wall candelabra that I have hanging. And this is just a shot of kind of how the room was set up. I arranged flowers and set them up on these pedestals, kind of to invoke.
Did you have any African influence there? Because that looks a lot like a lot of African artwork or ceramic artwork.
That's cool. You know, I have to be honest, Josie, I think that a lot of my process kind of up until now was pretty light on the research. So like I kind of just made what I wanted to see, pretty ignorant of like where these kind of images in my head were coming from, if that makes sense. So I think most of the form was just influenced by kind of these architectural places that I had been, and then also the way that the process builds the form. So I'll have like a general idea of what I want it to look like, but then just a lot of play happens. And I can kind of edit what I think looks good and what doesn't. Wow. So while that might not be very satisfying of an answer, that's the truth. So yeah, so this one is kind of, I just wanted to show you a process here and kind of some of the detail. This is a music box here, and I found that the dark clay bodies really communicate well for me, this idea of stillness. I'm like always thinking about what makes something quiet and reflective, and where that sort of spiritual energy comes from. And I always go back and forth between a super detailed, intricate idea or something more simple. I always wonder, but recently I was listening to something, and I realized that like, I think that I'm drawn to these intricacies in the same way that, when we look out a window and we watch like a tree blow in the wind, there are so many intricacies there. It's so much detail, but something in us like quiets, and we sit and we just watch and experience that intricacy and that movement. And so I think it's less about me trying to create a symbol of stillness, but actually create an experience of stillness. And for me, the dark clay body is a very inward tool, I guess. Hopefully that makes sense. But this comes apart in a few different pieces. So while this was a music box, I also kind of thought about it like a reliquary. Just something that you can take apart, put something in, put it back together and hold it safe. Just more of that idea of kind of inwardness and treasure. Sylvie, does anyone speak French? Sylvie Angel there, I don't know really how to pronounce her last name, but she is the one exception of like something that I aspire to as far as simple form, and how when I look at her work, I'm just pretty drawn, like I'm just brought to tears, quite honestly. And I'm very quiet in the presence of her work, but it's not detailed. So I'm not sure, I'm like struggling with that myself. That's like kind of why you would call this artwork, is because I'm trying to figure this out. But I just wanted to be honest and share that. Here's just another reliquary that I had for that show. Very crusty, like no glaze, but a lot of ash that didn't end up melting. It was really nice. Oh gosh, my apologies. Here's a couple of candelabras. This is a pretty tall one. It's probably like 2.5 feet tall. So I had the room very, very dark. This is kind of silly picture of me, but you can kind of see how the room was mostly lit up by these candles. Just another one. I was really imbibing with all of these shots, so just bear with me here. So as my work continued, and after that show, I began thinking about all of that idea of kind of the ritual, stillness, quiet. And I began to think about kind of my own identity and what it really means for myself, what it means to be like a feminine creature. And so I started just working with the vessel. I mentioned that before. And I guess I didn't really set out to have this work mean anything, but I really wanted to just work through some of the thoughts that I had. So I knew I wanted to make something of this form, but I just wasn't sure what it was going to mean in the end, but I just wanted to make it so that it could show me. But here's an example of what kind of surprises happen in the clay world. This orange sand that you see on this porcelain vessel is really prominent here, which I loved. And then after the firing, it just burnt out.
Oh, it's beautiful, that orangey color.
I know. Thank you. I know. That was sand I gathered from my friend's house in Boulder, Utah, too. So it's particularly important to me.
Is there still texture left on it to represent where the sand was? Yeah.
Yeah, it just looks like granulated sugar, But so that's beautiful. But I just put it in the snow, kind of in frustration and I was kind of humbled by my grand plan and left it there for a while. So sometimes things don't work out, but so I sold this piece and it was meaningful in the end. So with this idea of self, kind of an inward looking at my own self as opposed to more of a vague notion of the self, I decided to do a series of these small bud vases. And I began thinking a lot about, my ancestors and kind of searching for answers in that way. So this is my grandma, Beverly Jean. She had a beautiful garden, and she wasn't a potter or anything, but she was just a quiet soul. And I just feel like I'm kind of her in the end. So, oh gosh. So, Josie, this kind of reflects what you asked before. These are jamon pots that are actually Japanese influence, but in this kind of self-searching, I decided to move backwards, kind of work backwards and research ceramic history, for goodness sakes. For so long, I had just been kind of exploding with ideas without much of the ceramic history research. And so I came upon these pots and I just was blown away by how much we had in common. This piece here is an incense vessel. So this idea of ritual, negative space. And then this vessel, it is a ritualistic vessel of some sort. I mean, I get you're not exactly carrying water for miles in that beautiful vessel. So I was just encouraged with all of my thoughts on ceremony and selfhood and how that process influences identity and culture and social interaction. So that felt really, really good to find that. This piece is a planter that I made. It was actually the first piece that I made when I arrived here in Rochester. So this is a pretty important piece for me. Just a lot of time, process, starting with the base as usual and moving up. I was humbled by the humidity here. When I made this part that comes out, and then tried to build up, and the whole thing collapsed because I had my timing all wrong. In Montana, things dry fast, but here it's so much more humid. So I had to really slow down my already slow process. So that's good. It's good when you're encouraged, you know, by your instincts. Here's some other vessels that I've been working on.
Karlene, can I interrupt just for a second? Are you
Please.
finding that the different times of year help your process to speed up or slow down? Like I find it really dry here in the winter, but I don't know really how much work you make in the winter. And you were talking about your current work being out on your porch. And right now I feel like it's so humid outside with like the dew on the grass every overnight. And especially with the fluctuations in temperature between the really hot days and how cool it's been right now. I could imagine that, even when you think you've mastered the level of humidity, right, there's more lessons to be learned. I don't know, what about, I assume that you've been here through a winter.
Yeah, I arrived last August, so it's almost been a year. And yes, absolutely, your instinct is right on. The weather is everything. And actually, it's really funny because with wood firing, the same thing. Atmospheric pressure will influence how that kiln fires. And so, like, whether working out on the porch, all the different weather fluctuations matter. I keep things really wrapped up with plastic as I'm working too. But so like these pieces are each about 24 inches tall. So they're as tall as the kiln will let me go. And they take, a good week or so to really get to their form. And then I work out details and stuff after that. So, but, in regard to timing and waiting, these are all, even though they're solid forms, they're built using multiples. So back when I showed that basket, that very first slide, those were all beads, multiple beads put together. But the same thing happens here. So I make each of these separately, and they need to set up, and then I can attach them and layer things in a little bit at a time to make them strong. And once they feel strong, then I can continue to move up. But it's definitely a relationship. It's a discipline. And so say like this is a prime example of making a bunch of these circles and then attaching them one by one. But also in regard to seasons influencing the timing and thoughts on the work, these are all about their function is like for long-stemmed flowers. So these are big vases that will hold water and hold flowers. So just more and more growth, thoughts on growth. Oh, details, can't get away from that. I do notice like some more humbling moments of certain processes that I'm really attracted to don't always work perfectly. So I get these really beautiful kind of organic chasms and cracks that come apart, and instead of freaking out, I end up embellishing them. And I think, I remember talking to Josie about this particular piece actually, and I was like, maybe I'll plug it and make it work. And she's like, are you crazy? You got to embellish that. It's so beautiful. So I did. I ended up putting gold detail there. And I'm so glad I did. Thank you, Josie. And here's another flower vase here. Returning to that dark, dark clay body. Multiple pieces at a time. This is another of that same, it's a slightly bigger than the last one in process. I haven't been able to glaze it yet just because of quarantine. It's just waiting.
Was there some, sorry, Karlene, was there green in there in the other one before? Like in the little,
It's ozone blue actually.
Okay.
So I just stained. You can kind of see where it's really kind of rustic and metallic is an oxide stain, so that it can really like absorb, sort of like watercolor would absorb into paper. The stain absorbs into the clay body and just embellishes the contrast and the texture, but especially like where the sand lands, without covering it. But I did want to do little pops of detail. So in each one of these, throughout the whole thing, there's a little dollop of Cone 6 ozone blue glaze. And I'll glaze this one and stain this one the same way.
Cool.
I'm also continuing this idea of the bucket. This one is at my house, or I built it here. So I kind of challenged myself to work with more negative space that worked into solid, so it could hold as a functional vessel, but also emerge into this negative. So I really like this kind of trick on the eyes type of thing. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I'm just envisioning floral design, a lot of grass, tons of grass in this piece. And if you don't mind, I actually picked out a poem that goes with this piece that I may not be very good at researching art history, but I do research. Like I do a lot of reading and listening. And I picked out a poem by Rilke that kind of speaks to my really love for this darkness as beauty and this kind of inward looking process. It's short, but he writes, "I love the dark hours of my being, in which my senses drop into the deep. I have found in them, as in old letters, my private life that is already lived through and become wide and powerful now, like legends. Then I know that there is room in me for a second huge and timeless life. But sometimes I am like the tree that stands over a grave, a leafy tree, fully grown, who has lived out that particular dream that the dead boy around whom its warm roots are pressing, lost through his sad moods and his poems." So, you know, I do read a lot of Rilke, and that's kind of, you know, it's kind of like a heavy poem, but I don't mean this work to be sad or heavy, but it just is what it is. Here's a detail. This is a handle. I'm not sure if you'd really grip it, but that's what it is. And then here's kind of an abrupt transition into like today. I've also been making these garden pots that are quite functional, a little less sculptural and detailed, but these are all kind of a community-minded and intended project. So I'm kind of working out the details right now of kind of figuring out how to use my work to be helpful right now. I think that while it's true that art and beauty is helpful and just so necessary, I want to be a little more like immediately helpful, tangibly helpful. So I'm working on setting up a program where I could someone purchases a pot and then I donate a pot to someone who lives maybe in an urban environment and needs to grow things on their porch. So I'm working that out. But yeah, so I kind of talk about these like they're little porch pots. Putting up a sale today. We'll see what happens, but so similar ideas of growth and that is where I left it. This is just an inside of a soda kiln door. That was cool. So I'm please welcome any questions. I'm happy to go back to any slides if there are any more questions. But that's it for the photos that I have.
Karlene, I have one more question. How long do you work on average on one of these big vessels?
I won't make you dizzy here, but on this piece, this was happening during quarantine, so I was really just working on this only. And I was able to do this in about like 4 days. But these pieces, I was also substitute teaching, you know, working at the studio, teaching at the studio. So I'd say a couple of weeks for these. So it all just depends on what life is offering at the moment. But I do tend to work on a few at a time. So they end up being sisters, you know, in a way. So I'll, and that will help one set up while I can work on another one. So that actually cumulative, you know, all 3 of these, it would take a month or so to build. But really that's not that bad.
Oh, wow.
I have another question, Karlene.
Shoot.
You know, ceramics is an area where I have dabbled in it a few times in my, like, let's say past 30 years of doing various different kinds of arts and crafts, but I've never found a path in that I felt worked for me or really inspired me. Like I made a lot of really heavy, you know, work pieces that ended up not being very functional, split in the kiln, you know, whatever. They weren't my vision. I'm interested to know why hand building particularly is the direction that you've gone, as opposed to what, you know, in my own mind, I think when I look at the variety of classes that we offer in the ceramics department, we do so much focused on hand building. And, you know, a lot of those hand built forms maybe end up more smooth or start out smooth and then become embellished later on. And yours appear to be completely hand constructed from the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit about why the hand building as opposed to the wheel pieces, and, you know, like what that means for you as an artist in terms of being freeing or restricting or any of that kind of thing?
Yeah. Those last 2 words that you used, freeing versus restricting, I think is, that's all of it. So, you know, when I do really like the wheel, and in particular, I love the kick wheel. And I think that, for me, the kick wheel in its slow speed and in kind of its wabi-sabi nature, it is open, it's free. It allows me to work slower. And I think that it is that slowness that allows for intention for me. So each of these pieces, like you said, they're constructed by hand each and every part of the way. And it's just that slow speed allows me to make my decisions one at a time, methodically, slowly. And I think that's maybe less of a decision and more of a personality trait. So I think that that is just part of who I am too. I'm kind of a slow burning candle. My favorite metaphor is a big wheel turning slow. So I do feel like I am making progress as a person, or like on a piece. You know, the vessel makes progress. It builds its identity and itself, but it's slow. But once it's down the hill, it's finished. You know, it's accomplished. So I think that's one way to think about it at this time.
And it spurs off a follow-up question. I'm sorry to monopolize folks in case you've got other questions, so I'll try to hold back after this last one.
Thank you for asking. Yeah.
I do wonder sometimes if when you start to make a piece, if the finished piece is what you originally had in mind when you started, or if as you go along, you find yourself influenced by different factors, and so what ends up sometimes maybe even surprises you that it's not really what you thought you were going to do, or if you're really able to sort of like, you start out with a sketch and the whole intention is to just build that thing that you already had, and you know, like, how does that work?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move to this piece to help answer my question. I think the way that I think is in motifs. So In general, I'll start off with an idea in my head, a general form, like a silhouette almost. So I'll have kind of this form, this shape in mind, and then I'll know what motif I want to start with, and I work that way. Once I have a motif finished, then I think, oh, wouldn't that be beautiful if it could grow vertically right here. And then I'm going and I edit myself and I stop. And then I think, okay, I'm going to turn this piece around, look at it on the other side. And then how could this motif function to meet this here? So kind of, it's like a community of motifs, like all socializing and coming together. So to answer your question, it really unfolds before me. And I don't necessarily, like this image was not in my head when I started, but this image kind of was, if that makes sense. So I had this kind of form with this point at the top. I liked that idea. And from that, this was born. And then it's all one. So, however, with these, it's a lot more straightforward. I can control it a lot better because it is so repetitive. So I know that I'm going to start solid and then do florets all the way around. And there is a little wobble, it's cute, has a little stance there, but for the most part, it's kind of easily controlled. So that's another thing to wrestle with, is control versus intention. Like I believe I can still be intentional and humble while working. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had a few questions.
Cool.
I actually have a bunch of questions and maybe some comments too.
Okay.
I do want to talk a little bit more about your teaching. Was that pre your medium of clay, or was that after you studied?
Mm-hmm.
How did that fit into? And then where did clay come in after the teaching, or was clay part of teaching?
That's a good question. I started teaching first. It was kind of just a thing that I had always been doing, babysitting, whatever. It just made sense. It was kind of just a natural path. And actually, my first summer after my freshman year of college, I got a job as an art teacher for a summer camp in Warrensburg, New York. So moved to New York the first time from Montana for a summer and taught that way. And it was just like kind of I need to get out of Montana this summer idea. I was just feeling brave. So I did it, and it was great. And then when I came back to Montana, that is when I got heavily involved with the Zootown Arts Community Center, where I ended up being able to teach all those wonderful classes, and taught there as the youth art director for about 4 years, and then volunteered actually with them for about 4 years too. And I was actually in the elementary ed program in college, and I went through such a struggle once I I'll back up. So, I took all sorts of classes kind of in a rebellious nature, just to take whatever I wanted outside of my field. And I took a ceramics class, and I just was so hooked on the material. I cried over it. I couldn't figure out what to do. I ended up deciding to drop out of the teacher ed program based on a dream that I had, that I needed to get into clay more seriously. And so maybe that informs why I'm so heady in my head all the time about it, but it's very meaningful for me. And I think just a quick anecdote related to your question, was when I was in one of the teacher ed classes, and a professor had us all stand up and present. He asked us, why do you even want to be a teacher? And all of my peers stood up and said, I want to be a coach, or kids are so cute. You know, it's the future. And I stood up and I felt so alone, because my answer was like, I just want to help kids realize what their truth is. And then that's kind of when I realized that I wasn't really going about my like vocation in the right way.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that's how I came to Clay.
Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that you're influenced by ceremonial and reverent places that you visited as a child.
Mm.
Because I was curious about that. And it's interesting too that Josie mentioned, you know, are you influenced by Africa? Because your work seems so like it came from an archaeological dig in a way. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's hard for me to explain it, but it's yeah, like maybe a church was buried and then got dug back up. And
Oh, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I love that. Yeah. I mean, Montana is such a landscape, right? And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be like arrogant, but that's where I spent most of my life so far. So that's where it comes from, like this geological time is really present. And then maybe that's part of where like all of the sedimentary process comes from, that leads to real slowness. But so I think that just being so connected to my place and my landscape, while having a really devout influence on my like thoughts and identity, kind of merged in this really beautiful kind of, I don't know, old way. Yeah.
Another thing that came up for me was like, I think what I'm getting from you is that you feel that it's very important for the objects you create to have a function, to have work.
Yeah.
But are you ever feeling the need to just make something purely sculptural, or are you entirely against that it has to have functionality?
I think that I really desire to play while I work, which lends to something becoming sculptural.
Mm-hmm.
But I do kind of struggle personally with feeling like pointless. Just, you know, I want to have an influence and be useful as a human being. I don't just want to like be there. And so I think that even as a ridiculous flower bucket or like a reliquary, I think those two things are still functional in a way. So I don't know, I guess I play with that. I was trying to think if I really have a good example of something I've made purely sculptural. I made one like figurative piece, but it was completely out of the box. It's not at all what you'd expect. And it was fun and it felt good, but it like fell apart and I just threw it away.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of nice because even though it is functional, it is also pure beauty, you know? So you, in a way, you get the best of both worlds with what you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that, I don't know, I guess that idea of figurative and maybe, you know, I feel already kind of guilty about my response because there's just so much beautiful work out there that is sculptural and that like I really admire. But in the end, those artists are who they are, and like I am who I am, and I can admire them, but also feel like I have to make functional work at the same time.
Absolutely.
But it's like still like my work will never be utilitarian. So how functional is it? You know, really, I'm kind of kidding myself.
Maybe it's a symbolic functionality, even if, you know.
Yeah.
That's important for sure for you, it seems. Someone asked a question in the chat. Diane wants to know what brought you to Rochester. Is it through the AIR program or?
Yeah, it was through Flower City Arts Center. So honestly, I just felt like it was time to try something new. And I referenced my boyfriend, Chris, earlier. His family's on the East Coast. They're in Massachusetts. So we decided to just put a bunch of applications out there, and Flower City was really the best fit. So it was purely this residency that brought me here.
How do you feel about Rochester now that you've been here a while?
It has been such a funny experience moving somewhere new, and having like spring come at a time like this, like while COVID is here. I'm so grateful for all of this lush growth around here, and the parks are like arboretums. Like that just is not the case in Montana. It's a high desert there, and so I just had so much fun getting to know the birds, different bird calls, and the food and the people. Like I just love having a diversity of minds and like community around me. So I'm really liking it. And the Finger Lakes region is just cool. Like since we can't really make a lot of like new relationships right now, we've been going out and exploring around the Finger Lakes and hiking around. So I really like it. We could probably hang out for a bit, but I'm going to stay for my second year, and so is Zara too. So we'll be here through another year. So it's great.
Wonderful. We're pretty much at our hour, but if anyone has any last questions they want to ask before we head out, you're welcome.
I had a quick comment.
Yeah.
And actually, it's good that you happen to be on the slide.
Good.
I loved it when you just were describing your creative process while creating this piece, you know, and I could sort of follow along, and it was very internal. Wonderful. I love that. It was very impactful for me to hear you go through that. I felt like I was like by your side while you were making this piece. You know? It was very cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you for witnessing that experience that you had. Like talked about it, because that me hearing you have that kind of internal experience is really important. So I appreciate that.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
Gosh, you guys, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.